Thank you all for tolerating my first attempt at hosting a Zoom chat. I will do better next time. I am drinking, and I'm really excited for this. I've had it before. It's the Shirts and Blouses pancake ale aged in maple syrup barrels. I'm mainly endorsing it because it has Prince on the can slam dunking a stack of pancakes, and I'm mainly here for the art. It is a perfectly acceptable beer. So if you want to check it out, it's from...
Is it made in Minneapolis?
It's made in Ashland, Virginia. And I haven't lived in Virginia long enough to know where Ashland is.
We are not muted, and I could do my Prince impersonation, but I'm going to let that go.
Let that slide for now. That's
so
for later.
People who joined in, the question on the floor, you can unmute yourself. Hey, Ofe, Caroline, to see everybody here. You can unmute yourself and tell. The question is, what's in your glass?
What are you drinking for happy hour?
I'm drinking an gin infused with fresh hops from the vine and house-made tonic.
Okay, it's a can of gin and tonic.
It's a can of gin and tonic.
I'm so proud. I mean,
I'm too lazy to make a gin and tonic, and because it's happy hour, which I'm glad you reminded me.
Oh my God, how did you not know?
I'm drinking Miller Lite because I'm a
nice
girl.
Not quite craft, but we're going to go with it.
Yeah, sorry.
Oh, craft talk, craft beer.
I'm clever like that.
Oh.
Good.
Stuart, thank you for the gesture.
Okay, just gesture of hands. Who got that link before I did?
Not me.
I totally got it. I just disregarded it.
My job is here.
All right, well, we're at 5:06, and we do want to keep this to about an hour, since I mean, I know we all have a lot of other things to do.
I got theater tickets.
Yeah, theater tickets. I'm going to a concert. No, but we just want to have a quick, fun craft talk here. I'm going to try to keep an eye out. If I look away randomly from time to time, it's to let people into the chat. So we talked about beers. My name is Zach Powers. I'm the Director of Communications at the Writers Center. I'm also an author. I've published a story collection and a novel. Amy, you want to introduce yourself too? No? Okay. Amy's...
Amy Freeman, Development Director at the Writers Center. Hey, Sally, welcome. That's it.
And then we have Rion Amilcar Scott, who is our guest author today.
Hey.
Rion, who are you? Tell us real quick in 12 words or less.
I'm just some guy from who lives in Annapolis, who's written 2 books. The second one is this one, The World Doesn't Require You, a collection of short stories. And the first one was Insurrection.
Actually, can you hold that up so people can actually see it? Because it's a beautiful cover. There we go.
Art by Dr. Fahamu Piku. Sure I'm mispronouncing that. But yeah, so it's my second story collection. And I teach at University of Maryland. Online, apparently.
Well, thank you for joining us. Real quickly, if you don't know the Writers Center, most of you do, but I know I passed this along in some places that beyond the DC area. We are a literary arts nonprofit, been around since 1976, and we support writers and everyone who wants to write. And during this time of quarantine, we've moved all of our workshops online, and we've started doing some events like this. This is our first time at an event, or doing an online event. So please.
It's going really well.
It's going great. And last thing I want to mention before we get to the talk is we did partner with Old Town Books. It's a independent bookstore in Alexandria, Virginia. And one of the things we want to do with these is to partner with these bookstores and encourage, if you don't have Rion's books, please buy them because they're great. And if you buy them from one of your local independent bookstores, if you don't have one, please consider Old Town Books. They're a fabulous bookstore, and they're certainly taking a bit of a hit here with people not being able to go into their store and browse. That's going to be the same for all of your bookstores that you may usually go to. So please, if you go to the Facebook page or our website, there's a link to Old Town Books, and you can find books online and order them there. We'll be supporting Old Town in the future, as well as other local bookstores as well as we go forward with these events. So please, 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 we want to support writers, and one of the best ways to support writers is supporting your local indies. Sorry?
There's been a request that you mute everybody except you and Rion. There was no carve out for me, but if you can mute participants so people can hear you better.
Okay, I will mute everyone real quick, then unmute myself and Rion.
And me? No? Okay, goodbye.
Okay, I lost Rion. This was a
You
good
muted
idea in
him.
theory.
You
I
muted
unmuted
him.
you. I'm looking. There we go. Okay. All right.
All right, I'm back.
Woo! That worked. That was terrifying. And last thing I'm going to mention before we start my questions is we're going to definitely save some time for questions and chat at the end. So if you have any questions, please type them in chat. If you haven't found chat, if you hover your mouse over the bottom of the screen, there'll be a little bar that pops up. You can click the chat button and just type in whatever questions you have as we go along, and we will do our best to get to as many questions as possible. Please forgive us if we miss one. Again, we're not very good at this. Rion, do you have, I did want to ask you if you had a section you could read, just a short excerpt so people can hear your book, because it's sort of related to my first line of questions for you.
Speaking of first lines, I'm gonna read the first page.
Oh.
It's a story called David Sherman, the Last Son of God. I was about to turn it like that made a difference. I'm used to reading to my kids, so like that made a difference, but it.
Just draw some pictures on the first page so you have something to show from now on.
There are pictures later in the book.
Okay.
But anyway, God is from Cross River. Everyone knows that. He was tall, lanky, wore dirty brown clothes, and walked with a limp he tried to disguise as a bop. His chin held a messy salt and pepper beard that extended to his Adam's apple, always clutching a mango in his hand. He used to live on the south side, down under the bridge, near the water. Now, there's a nice little sidewalk and flowers and a bike trail that leads into Port Yuga. Back then, there was just mud and weeds, and he'd sit there barefooted, softly preaching his word. At one time, he had 100, maybe 200, some say up to 500 or even 1,000 people listening. But the time I'm talking about, he'd sit with only 1 or 2 folks, always with a mango, except during Easter time when he'd pass out jelly beans to get people to stop and listen. He lived on the banks of the Cross River until one day he filled his pockets with stones and walked into the water and sank like a crazy poet. He wasn't insane. It was all part of God's plan. Last time he was crucified, this time drowned. Anyway, God can't drown. He'll come back, perhaps to oversee the writing of another testament or to judge the living and the dead, whatever he feels.
Thank you. So I was really, I guess I feel fortunate because I heard you read from this book a couple times, I think even before it was published, and certainly before I read it.
Mm-hmm.
And I felt fortunate because you reading it out loud really reinforced the rhythm that's going on in this book. And I love the rhythm of your writing. It is some of these, I can't remember the name of the story, but the ones with the giant birds that swoop down and eat people.
A Loudness of Screechers.
Yeah, Loudness of Screechers. The screech, that one, I heard that one a couple times. So I actually got to like really focus in the second time I heard it. Not focusing on content, but really focusing. Oh, someone's moving things. I've muted them. So it was really interesting to me to be able to hear the rhythm before I had to read the book. And then when I read the book, your voice was in my head, man. It was just like, I heard you the whole time I was doing all this. So a lot of my first line of questions is really about rhythm. I think it's something, I think poets talk about it more than us, but it's not something I think we as prose writers talk about quite as much as maybe we should, if I can use that word. So how do you think about rhythm while you write?
Yeah, man, I'm glad that you mentioned the poets because I think that's where I get it from. And I started off as a poet, and I think I didn't understand it when I was a poet. But it's, usually when I write a sentence, a lot of times I need to have the rhythm. I need to, sometimes I'm counting syllables to make sure that the syllables, it sounds good. Sounding good is probably more important than anything else to me. And I think the part of the process that I hate the most is reading it out loud. I find it so tedious, but it's just there is no other way. There's just absolutely no other way than actually hearing it, because then you hear the false notes.
So you're a reader out louder.
Unfortunately, yeah. I can't. I hate that part of the process, but it's necessary.
I mean, I'm totally going off script. I sent Rion some notes beforehand. I'm already abandoning them after the first question, so I apologize. But I remember when I was preparing for doing readings with my first book, I was reading a lot. I practiced. I was like, things I was planning to read, I read out loud. And like, I think with the next book, I'm going to be standing in front of a mirror performing the pieces, trying to figure out how they go, and think I'm going to like, what are there any particular changes you find from draft one to what changes after you've read the stuff out loud? Is there anything any particular points that jump out at you? Any particular problems you encounter regularly when you're reading out loud?
I mean, I think the regularly is, just like that just sounds flat, because when you're reading it in your head, it sounds perfect, and so just reading it just that sounds like a false note, and then go back and see where it is, where it's messed up, and it's a lot of times it's it's on the sentence doesn't work on the syllable level, and you have to figure out what type of words you need to add to make that as a bridge to make that work.
And I second that. I mean, I was on, I think this section, I can't do this. This section of shelves right here was like, that was the poetry I read over like a course of a year. I had like 50 poetry books. It was like the best exercise I ever did as a prose writer.
Oh yeah, I think every single, to me it's important. Every single day I read a poem. And I think that has been the most important thing to my prose. I felt like my prose was like very flat, and it was very, I couldn't figure out how to make it fluid. And then a professor told me to read a poem a day, and then so I've been doing that since 2005.
All right, I have two questions. One is how do you choose a poem, and the other is so I've heard this you should read your work aloud advice, but this is a very technical question. But if you drop a brick on your toe, do you stop then, or do you keep reading?
I stop.
And you revise right there?
Yeah, I stop. Yeah, because it usually comes at the end of the process. That's really at the end of the process. When it's down on the page. I think I read this book out loud 3 or 4 times, and just stop and make a notation. The first part of your question, how do I choose a poem? I'm just always looking. I don't necessarily do it randomly. I'm always reading a book of poetry, so I guess I do it sort of randomly, because I look at what's on my shelf, or if there's something I'm interested in, I might jump out and say, I'm interested in this particular author, and I'll see my way through that book. Somebody I might have heard read, or something I've been meaning to read for a long time. So it's kind of somewhat indiscriminate. Right now, someone had given me a book of poems by Stanley Plumley, and I've been reading that. I just finished that today.
So how do you know when you have the rhythm of a sentence right? Is it just gut feel? Is there just some moment of internal, like, huzzah, this is it? Or is there yeah.
You know. I think it's about sound. A lot of time. Rhythm. We talk about rhythm. I used to do a lot of satire, a lot of humor writing, and what I realized is that a good sentence often has things in common with a good joke. With the rhythm of that. And so if I can, if I think about how the rhythm is enhancing, whatever the characters are doing, or enhancing, the theme, or enhancing whatever other element, the elements that we talk about a lot, I think about how the rhythm is enhancing those particular elements. Sometimes people ask me how I get the characters to sound different. It's because they have different rhythms, and based on whatever's going on in their lives.
So you talk about characters having rhythms, but Cross River has its own music, and it's a major part sort of the plots of your stories. And
River Beat, yeah.
Yeah. Can you hear that in your head? Is that something can you hum us a few bars of that beat? Or is it the beat of your prose? Is it related somehow? Is that like is that informing how you write this prose?
Don't let him off the hook. Don't let him off the hook. Comment, please.
No, I mean, River Beat is completely imaginary. I can't hear. I mean, I guess I can hear it somewhat. In the characters, but I really want everyone to have their own River Beat.
Yeah.
So yeah, I mean, it's. I mean, I can and I can't hear it.
I mean, besides being a reformed poet, or recovering poet,
Failed poet.
Reformed. Okay, we'll go with that. And you've talked about this a little bit. Are there any other things you've done to improve your sense of rhythm as a writer? Is there anything besides reading poetry, besides reading out loud? We've covered two of the best techniques right there. But is there any other technique you'd toss to people here right now about how to improve the feeling of rhythm when writing prose?
Yeah, I mean, I think you have to be surrounded by rhythm, which means I listen to a lot of music, and I think there's a point in time where the podcasts were sort of new to me, and I was listening to a lot of podcasts, and I wasn't listening to a whole lot of music or any music at some points, and I was I thought I was fine with that until I would sit down and write, and I couldn't get the rhythms were off, and then I realized it's because I wasn't listening to music. So I sort of kind of surround myself. I don't listen to music as like I did when I was a teenager, but I make sure that it's in my life.
So what music are you recommending to writers to listen to improve their rhythm? That's the key question here, it seems like. Now.
Yeah, see, I mean, I think it's all for what you're trying to accomplish. I mean, my prose is is heavily influenced by Wu-Tang Clan, but I think that it's it's all up for what you're trying to accomplish. Heavily influenced by Parliament Funkadelic. I'm trying to think of what else. Yeah.
Well, so just everyone else in this chat now needs to realize that the rest of this conversation will be about how Old Dirty Bastard is in fact the greatest vocal stylist of all time. So we're going to be doing this. Amy, you actually have a real question.
Well, Zach, I know you are focused on your conversation, but if you open the chat window, there are some actual real questions that people have.
I was going to save those for the end.
Okay.
But we can also cover them now.
We're new to this, but people are like, who are the poets of Cross River? And I'd love to hear more about how Rion counts syllables and how that contributes to achieving sentence flow. And where do you like to read poems? So this is new to us, and we're working on the interactive thing, but I just thought I'd mess you up, Zach.
Thank you for derailing me completely.
All right, carry on.
But yeah, actually, I saw where do you find your daily poems, Rion? That's a good question to start with.
It's whatever I'm reading. I got a whole bookshelf full of books that I haven't read, so I start there. Or I might if there's someone that I'm interested in, I might go on on Twitter. I started really getting into Jericho Brown's poetry, and I'm glad that happened because he's just like one of the best. And his book, his last book was I read that. I might have read that twice. I don't know. Hanif Abdul Rakib's last book. That was also very important to me.
I haven't read it yet. I have
Uh,
it, but I've not read it yet.
Fortune for Your Disaster. Yeah, I started writing poetry again while I was reading it. I mean, the poetry wasn't very good. I went back and looked at it, and it wasn't as good as I thought it was. But
I'm sure it's great. And then someone else said, are you planning to stay with novels or stay with short stories or head towards a novel at some point?
no, I'm working on.
The never-ending question of the short story writer. You gonna write a novel, man?
Yeah, I've looked through a lot of interviews with Toni Morrison. And no one ever asked her when she's gonna write a short story collection. And I think
Maybe they should have. Maybe
that
they
was a
should
missed
have.
opportunity. It was a huge missed opportunity. A huge missed opportunity. I'm working on a novel right now, but my heart keeps calling back to short stories. So I can't hear anybody now. Zach, you've muted yourself.
Zach, you muted yourself.
I don't even know how I did that. Okay, so we talked about rhythm a lot, and I could talk about rhythm all day. But we also, another thing you do is I mean, your two books are collections of stories all set in the same place that you made up. So you are a master of world building. So all your stories from the first two collections are set in a fictional place called Cross River. And you've written 2 books worth of stories in this. Mm-hmm. I guess my question is, how did that all start? What brought you to Cross River in the first place?
I came by boat. No. Everyone's muted, so I don't know if that got a laugh.
It's so weird. I just assume.
I expected to write about the DC area. I just moved back to here from Binghamton, New York, and I started grad school. And I wanted all my writing to be set in the same place. I wanted characters to come in and out. And I was kind of like I wanted it all set in this area that I thought I knew well. When I started reading Edward P. Jones, and it's like, oh well, he knows this area a lot better than I do. He's got this. So I'll let him have DC. And I started thinking about what I could do, and I started I was like, there's no one could know a world that I make up better than me. And I think that works so much better than for me than setting it in real places. I don't need to be beholden to reality or geography or anything like that. I can I'm making up the geography. I'm making up everything. So that's how Cross River started.
So you're more DC comics and less Marvel comics. You have your Metropolis and your Gotham City.
Whoa! I wouldn't go that far. I wouldn't go that far. Okay, I feel like I've been insulted.
I apologize. I meant no offense. So I mean, you talked about what appeals to you about this fictive setting, but what does that allow you to do as a creator? What does separating yourselves from the requirements of real place allow you to do that writing in, say, a real town? How are you freed? How are you limited? What's the benefit or loss about that?
Yeah, I mean, it frees me up to not really worry about reality. It frees me up to lean into my more sort of imaginative side. I think if I make up the place, anything could happen, and I can rearrange, and I do rearrange geography to my will, just because of the needs of the story. I think I mean, there are no limits because there's no reason why people can't leave Cross River and go to DC if they want to on a field trip. And I've done that before.
like the Spider-Man movie.
What do you mean?
There's that
they went to London.
Yeah, they went to they also went to there's the big pivotal scene in the Washington Monument.
That's true. Yeah. So there's no I mean, I think one of the downsides is that since I write in such a way that everything is connected, it I think that sometimes I can't bring in, I can't bring in stuff that's completely contradictory to things that came before. I'm still working on ways to figure out how to do that. But I think to me the downsides are less than the upside.
So you mentioned that it allows you this sort of to introduce some fantastical elements, the impossible things, the speculative. What about those? I mean, what appeals to you about making things, not just making up a place, but making up the screechers, for example, which are not a real animal in the real world? What does the fantastical side allow you to do that you aren't necessarily doing with pure realist writing?
Yeah, I mean, to me, it's a lot of it allows me to write in such a way that is that's more metaphorical, I think. And to me, I mean, to me, it's a lot of fun moving away from that, moving away from the real, the more realist aspects, because it's it takes it back to to like some adventurous stories that I used to read as a kid. So it goes back to that element.
Well, that makes me just think, like, what you mentioned, the adventure stories of childhood. What other unexpected influences do you think you maybe have that people would be surprised to hear about?
So I read a lot of comic books growing up. The Wizard of Oz. There's always a big influence of mine. The Muppets, always a huge influence.
Muppet Show.
The Muppet Show, yeah,
Yeah,
Show.
yeah, absolutely.
The Muppet movie. I that stuff gets worked in, and sometimes I'm really surprised by the way that stuff gets worked in. I think in both my books, there are a lot of references to the Wu-Tang, the Muppets, and the Wizard of Oz, and those have always been important references to me.
Oh, if anyone hasn't watched the Muppet Show lately, I mean, go back and find episodes or clips or whatever from the Muppet Show. It's
just great comedy.
Yeah.
Jim was such a genius.
Mm-hmm. So how do you approach this world building, Is it something that's deliberate, or does it sort of just grow? You said you're happy to switch geographies around. Mm-hmm. So does it sort of also just, you start telling a story, you have this world you can play with however you want, so you deliberately set out to build a world first, or does the world sort of evolve as you're working on a story?
I think it's both. I have things in my mind. I've ideas that I've been developing in my mind. Like in the I think the second or third story, there are these sirens in this book. I think it's probably like the fourth story. It's called Numbers. I had that idea for a very long time. These river sirens. Had these ideas for a very long time, and then I was invited to take part in an anthology called Long Hidden, which was a speculative anthology. And I didn't feel like the idea was ready or was set in stone, but I didn't have anything else. So I pulled that. I pulled it from, and the Screechers also is an idea that I had for a very long time, and it's just like when I got the opportunity to write, I pulled it from my imagination.
Okay. Do you have any tips for writers who are working on building their own worlds, realistic or otherwise?
Yeah, I think it focus a lot on the small elements. Small elements like your history. I think those things can lead to like big elements. I have streets named after professors, and these things they come back. I got a unofficial town slogan that was once a Naughty by Nature lyric, and it has the whole history to it. It has a whole history to it that you won't find in my work. You know, you won't find the whole history, but it's there in my head. So you have to know a whole lot more about the world than is actually going to be on the page.
I love in writing, I drop so many inside jokes in
Yes.
everything I write that I immediately forget about and don't remember what the joke was.
Then you go back. Yeah.
But there's richness there, right? I mean, it feels like it makes it even richer for you if you don't know what the joke's about. There's like the fact that I like this was relevant for me in that exact moment I wrote it. I don't know. It feels good to have that in there if I don't know what I was talking about.
Well, readers pick up on it. I think readers pick up on it, and they make connections. Yeah, you're right that I think it does add a richness.
Yeah, and readers are sometimes smarter than we are.
Well,
Sometimes yeah, I mean, most of the time with me. But so I have a few questions already coming in from the audience. So we're going to look at those now and start moving that direction. If you're listening and want to ask a question, and you're new here, I have not gone over this in a minute. If you hover your mouse over the bottom of the screen, there'll be a button that pops up that says chat. Just pull up there and then type your message in the chat window, and we will start looking at some messages from our audience today. So the first one, we did a couple already, but we skipped this one, which was about counting syllables in your sentences and how that contributes to achieving sentence flow. While you're thinking about that, I'll tell one story. There's an author named Rachel Kadish, I know. She's based in Boston. I went to a talk she gave once. She is also a world-class, classically trained violinist and plays with one of the Boston symphonies. They have like 12, who knows which one. But when she's writing, she'll actually hear the rhythm before she knows the words, and she's created like her own system of notating what rhythm she wants, like with lines and dashes. And she will actually leave empty spaces for words and put down the rhythm she wants there. And rhythm being not just the length of the word, the number of syllables, but also the accents on the syllables, and even sometimes how the syllables, some syllables feel longer than other syllables. So, I mean, I'm not her, I could never do that, but it's an interesting, that's like the extreme level of concerning yourself with rhythm. Rion, what do you have for counting syllables and thinking about that kind of rhythm on that level?
Before I answer that, I remember the last story in my first book, and I wrote another story about the same time with this method. Was I was having a very difficult time writing the story, but I knew, and the story is written in dialect, Trinidadian dialect, and I knew that there would be certain words and phrases that were in the story. So so part of the writing, I wrote it word by word, in that part of my day writing would just be listing words. And I figured that, this word is going to be in the story, so I might as well just type it on the screen. And I was like, hopefully this all eventually comes together. And it did. So I basically, and there was another story, and I wrote that because I was, because I wanted to write in a dialect that I don't necessarily speak every day, but I understand and I know very well. And the other story that I was writing, it needed a higher level of lyricism than I knew I was capable of at that moment. So I was writing. So I wrote them word for word, and that was, I think they both came out good. But the question was, counting syllables. Is there a method? Is that was the question?
I mean, what about counting syllables? How intense do you get about the rhythm in a sentence, I guess, was sort of the implication.
Yeah, I wouldn't say it's necessarily that intense. It's sort of, I just, it's just, when I'm writing a lot of sentences, if it doesn't sound right in my head, I'll go back and it depends. It'll change story from story depending on the needs of the story. But I'll go back and make sure that sentence is has the rhythm that it needs. That'll make it sound right.
So from Carolyn, we have someone who's read your first collection, but not yet your second collection. How do you think your writing has changed from one collection to the next? And I guess just me in general, what have you learned as a writer going along, writing all these stories?
Yeah, I think from the first collection to the second, I feel like I feel freer. I think a lot of the first collection, they were sort of apprentice stories. And I was following very closely a lot of the masters. There's a story in there that's basically a rewriting of a Hemingway story. There are two stories in there that I didn't that I basically borrowed a lot of sentence structures from Edward P. Jones. A lot of stories following Chekhov's example, following August Wilson's example very closely in the first story in Insurrections. In that story, I wouldn't say I threw the templates out the window, but I didn't necessarily need to follow the templates as closely. So there's a more of a sense of freedom in there.
So it's the learn it to unlearn it kind of method, like
right. Yeah. But and the thing is, the thing that's interesting is a lot of the stories in this book I wrote at the same time or before the stories in the first book, but I couldn't get them ready. I couldn't get them right, and they sort of resisted those templates. And I didn't have the insight or maturity to get those ideas out. So it took me a very long time to go back and rewrite those stories. And break out of the templates, break out of that apprentice way of thinking.
I just wrote down resisting the templates, so I'm loving that phrase. So that's a beautiful way to think of that.
It's also the name of my
band. From Stuart, we have a question, I think specifically concerning water women. You intentionally set out to incorporate mythology into the stories, sirens, etc.
Yeah, I mean, I knew that was sort of an old, ancient idea. I like a lot of people, I grew up loving, the Odyssey and Greek myths. So I borrowed that and sort of tried to remake it.
All right. Again from Stuart, how do you balance putting in elements of history, especially I guess if I don't know if everyone here has read the collection and knows the background. So what is the background of Cross River first? Can you just share that so we can make sure everyone's on the same page?
Cross River was founded in 1807 by a group of rebellious ex-enslaved men and women.
All right. So how do you incorporate these elements of history without veering into diatribe? How do you keep this as a storytelling device and not a I'm trying to phrase this question for you, but I mean, does that make sense? Do you have an answer based on what I've said so far?
I mean, I think story. What I like about story is that it resists diatribe. It resists. If you're following along with a character, it's to me it gets kind of hard to be preachy, because a human being's life is so complicated, and so I think that I sort of I just try to focus on the story, follow through the path of the story. I don't really ever fear. I mean, I have strong convictions and strong opinions, but I don't ever really feel that I'm falling on the side of didacticism.
Do you ever want to fall on that side of?
No, not really. I just want to tell the stories. I mean, I think reality has its own bias anyway. Reality has a left-wing bias as it is. So
what's the function of story? I mean, we're in a weird time right now, and this is I sent Rion some of my questions earlier, but the end was just audience questions and riffing. So this is the riffing part. In a time like this, with like some real shit going down in the world,
mm-hmm.
What's our role as fiction writers? What are we doing? What do we help? What do we accomplish? What are we contributing to?
Well, I think I try to follow the example of Toni Morrison as much as I can without being someone of average intelligence. She talks about how writing is a form of activism, and that the hardest times is when writers are called to do their work. That's not the time to fall back. And I think and that's something that she had to even tell herself. It's not something, not like she automatically had that feeling. She had to tell herself that. And so I never think that what I'm doing is not important, or what everyone else is doing. I never think that it's not important. I think all the things that we're going through, we need people to think deeply about them and help us to really sort of get an understanding beyond the platitudes or didacticism. And I think that's we're called to write about we're called to write about the things that we're obsessed about. And if you're not shallow, you're going to be obsessed about the things that are going on with your fellow man and how societies are organized. And it's going to seep into the work.
So writing is in some way, it's an inherently political thing, and I don't even mean that in the, I feel like that word's so whatever right now, but it's not even, yeah, okay, I like that.
Yeah, and I think, to me, it's always going to seep into the work, even without trying. I think that my favorite part of the book was the whole this part, and a lot of people pointed out, is I say something about how it's not the tyrant, it's the people around the tyrant. I wrote that. I wrote that after Charlottesville. I know I was thinking of Charlottesville, that that it's not Donald Trump. It's that's gonna walk down the street and kill Heather Heyer. It's the people that follow him. And I wrote that. I didn't write that as I didn't write that thinking, when I sat down to write, I wasn't saying I'm gonna write something, I'm gonna get him. I'm gonna get that Trump. I'm gonna avenge this murder. But it's something that sort of just came out naturally in the work.
I mean, when my book came out, it's set in the Soviet Union and is all about fabricating a reality. And this came out in the height of the phrase fake news. And no, I wrote this book 5 years ago.
Right.
It's also the fact that if you're delving into these things, they're going to be everything's relatable to the present moment. If you're being honest in the way you're approaching your own work, you're going to reveal something about the present moment, just because
Yes.
even if the moment is not present when the book is published.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I mean, there's nothing new under the sun. Fake news is it's a kind of propaganda.
So another question from Joseph Schwartzberg. Good to see you, Joe. Does Rion ever think or view characters as instruments being introduced to the symphony of the story? For instance, is there a character that's essentially a drum and someone who's more like a piano? How do these characters contribute to? Are there people who have different musical parts to the composition?
I would love to think that way. I just don't have the musical knowledge to think that way. But I think I do see them as like toys in the toy box. And I think, this writing to me is very, very, very connected to what I used to do when I used to play with toys. And so I think of, I can pull out, this particular action figure, and put this particular action figure into the story.
Yeah, that's funny, because I think about a lot about the fact that I have an older brother, and we had a lot of G.I. Joes. That was probably one of our main toys, but we never played G.I. Joe. We played Libyan terrorists.
Exactly.
And pieced together, my brother was older, so he had this slightly more worldly view that I didn't understand. But the premises of our games were never based on the shows that the toys came from. They were always these separate, so it was the world building was happening automatically in our play, even in a way I didn't necessarily understand, but it was, I'm sure, seeping into my head somehow.
Yeah, exactly. I used to make up my own stories with them. I used to play in 30-minute or hour-long blocks, because I used to imagine I had my own TV station. And so I used to always try to begin my play at the hour or the half hour and say my parents wanted me to clean up my room or something, and I couldn't start playing until 3:15. Well, I would wait till 3:30 to start playing, so I take that. I do think of it sort of like play. It's very close to that.
Someone has asked, did you ever meet Toni Morrison?
No.
That's
No,
a sad.
I would have.
yeah.
I would probably collapsed or something like that. I would have loved to. A lot of I would have definitely asked her that short story question. I was when she was putting out a short story collection. Her one short story sort of kills every short story. Most of the short stories that most of us are writing.
I don't need to read that. That would just hurt me.
Incredible. It's incredible.
Don't humble me too much. I can't handle it. No, but yes, I've read it. So, Stuart mentions that in your writing, you seem to drop a lot of dialogue tags and pronouns, such as lived in Southside versus he lived in Southside. Is that just part of making it read with the flow of natural speech? Is there some other reason that you truncate or edit out?
Yeah, I think the pronoun thing. I think that's just something that's just been something that I've developed over the years. I don't know if it's close to natural speech, but that's just something I've developed. I've thought about that lately. That's a sentence structure that I feel is, I wouldn't say uniquely me, but it's part of my style that's there. I kind of when I never want to write anything that's generic that anyone could have written. I want people to to feel like, yeah, Rion Amilcar Scott wrote this. I think it's one of the things that's there, and that kind of distinguishes my prose. With the dialogue tags, a lot of people talk about this. I just hate dialogue tags. And I think when it comes to like the quotation marks, to me it's dropping them helps create a more dreamlike environment.
So I have some more questions coming, but also please use the chat feature. Hover your mouse over the bottom, find the chat button, and type in on the right side of the screen any questions you might have for Rion. We have a few more minutes here. We're going to try to cover with some more questions. I always think in terms of dialogue tags, there's also that like middle school lesson they give you where you replace the word said with as many different words that mean the same thing, or like, yeah. So
that is dead movement.
Yeah, and I think it's the greatest disservice done to the future of writers that they feel like they need to make the dialogue tags creative.
Yeah, I'm glad I'm too old for that. I've been subjected to that. That's educational malpractice right there.
He exclaimed. He ejaculated. Of course, ejaculated is the worst and most frequent offender of.
Right.
Thank you, Vanetta, for pointing.
I mean, if I was in high school, I mean, that's actually on the list that they put out there, the teachers put out there. I mean, if I was in high school, that would be, if I turned in something, that would be every single one of my dialogue tags in.
Yeah, I mean, I think, and I mean, not while we're waiting for some more questions, like dialogue tags are supposed to be invisible language, and sometimes it's okay if language is invisible. They it should serve I believe personally, because there's no universal advice, that they should serve the bare minimum of orienting when they're needed.
Well, and the other thing is with dialogue tags are if you're putting, speaking of invisible language, if you're using something other than said, a lot of times you're editorializing and you're putting a lot of emotional weight on words that should be invisible, and it just makes them stand out. And if you want he exhorted forcefully, it's better to show that than to actually put that, because that, putting them in dialogue tags does nothing for your story and does nothing to help reveal a character.
Yeah. And of course, as always, there are exceptions to this rule, and
yes,
incredibly convoluted dialogue tags that blow me away when I see them. Yeah. Adverbs that blow my mind. So we have this question came earlier. I just want to, I'll cover, like, another question of where do you find your poems? You said you have just a stack of unread books. You just keep up with poetry in general. Is that how you find your stack of unread books?
Yeah. I keep up. If there's a poet that I really want to read, I make sure to, get their books into my hands. I think beginning of the year, I really wanted to read Tommy Pico, and I wasn't disappointed. I think I mentioned Jericho Brown earlier. Yeah.
So on that one, are there any specific poets you recommend for prose study? Like if there's a prose writer who has for some reason ignored poets entirely, who are like your top few first names that pop into your head to recommend? Read these people.
I feel like it's one of those questions where the words sort of fly out of your head. But if I were to top, Gwendolyn Brooks, I would read Gwendolyn Brooks. Who else is there? I gotta come back to that.
Okay, well, just announce them as you think of them as we go forward. So what's next? As in tomorrow? As in the day after tomorrow? As in 6 months? A year?
I'm just sitting here. That's we can't go outside. Can't do anything.
Are you managing to write right now? Are you getting some writing done, or
no? I'm not. No, not that I don't want to. It's just that I have a lot of work. Working to put my class online is just it's very difficult. And I think that's a way for a lot of teachers.
How does teaching? How does teaching work with writing for you? Is it interrelated? Is it a separate act? Is it something that you?
No. Back to Toni Morrison. She said, "I read books. I teach books. I write books. It's all the same activity. It's all the same job." So I think it's all connected. Students will say something that'll just be like, "Oh wow." And I think that I've gained a lot of insights about how to write from working closely with students.
I love just the act of deep reading when I'm doing a workshop for someone else. It's like it feels like it keeps my own chops ready to come back to my own work, and it's practice. It's shedding. Yeah. So what short story collection or novel, what fiction are you reading right now?
Fiction am I reading right now? Reading Heads of the Colored People by Nafissa Thompson Spires. I'm teaching that. Okay. That's a really, really great short story collection. Let's see. I am let's see what now. I'm reading this what's his name? I'm reading this Norman Mailer novel.
Okay.
That's
how's that going? That's I'm gonna cut out that noise when I get the video of this, and I'm going to have that on like a buzzer whenever everyone says Norman Mailer's name. So from Caroline, actually, I think this is a really interesting question. Do you think we as writers should be writing about the pandemic?
Yes.
Yes. Okay.
Yeah, we're living in historical times. People need to understand what it meant. I need people to live with this fear. We made a horrible, as a society, we made a horrible mistake. And a lot of us knew it from the first moment that we made this horrible mistake. Society needs to know the consequences of that mistake, and the consequences have been, thousands of people, or one of the consequences, the worst consequence has been thousands of people dead, and living with this great fear right now. We need to do something with that, and it's better than just sitting around. It's better than just sitting around. And so, like I was saying before, you have to write about your obsessions. This is the thing that I'm obsessed about right now. But that doesn't mean everything that you write should, you should rush to publish it immediately. Writing and publishing are separate. A lot of things we're feeling, we're not gonna be able to understand it so much later. So writing a lot of times is checking in with yourself. So writing and publishing are separate. We should be writing about it, but there's not necessarily, I don't necessarily think that everything you write has to be published immediately. You have to look at it, take a look at it, step back from it, think about it. Are you really saying what needs to be said? Have you gotten past the first draft?
I feel like too that there's going to be indirect influence.
Yes.
That documenting things now isn't necessarily to publish the things you write now, but to have your brain thinking on this subject, so that, the next story you write in Cross River might have really direct relevance to what we're talking about at this moment.
Yeah. I think that, if you sit down and write whatever you're writing about, it's probably gonna seep in there in some way.
Anyone have any further questions? I'm going to take one or two more.
Mary Kay wanted me to clarify. It's a mistake, the election. Yes.
Oh, sorry, I missed that one.
The election of Donald Trump. Yeah, it was a horrible mistake we made as a people. And even if we didn't vote for it, we have to own it.
I'm going to give it a few more seconds for any questions. Anything else you wanted to add, Rion, before any single thoughts you had on writing in this time of self-isolation, writing in this time of what's going to probably be an unimaginable tragedy by the time it's all done?
And I think that, you just got to keep your pens in gear. You just got to keep going. It's easier said than done, of course. But I think you have to sit down and write and not think about writing. Not think about it as necessarily, I have to write the great American novel or the great short story, but you have to just keep writing, and it may come to nothing, but you have to sit down and put the words on the page.
Well, we've reached 6 o'clock, and we did want to try to end right around now, so I'm gonna Amy had a question here, so we'll look at Amy's question real quick before we end. So many people believe there was no mistake involved, so how do we capture that sort of willful denial of what seems so obvious to many of us?
One of the things that I was thinking of, let me speak first about, like, if you're writing something that's satirical, it's a satire, like, there's shame, right? It exists, it exists because of shame, right? You can laugh at things because of shame. A lot of these, the administration has no shame. That's why I think a lot of satire about the president falls flat. But there are people around him that that know better, but they're craving. Their power. They're doing this. They support him for the sake of power. That, to me, that's where the target should be. But I think that we do it without didacticism, with compassion. And I think that you write and you focus on the character, get inside what your characters are really feeling and thinking, particularly if they're different than you, and start understanding, have empathy, but think about who you're having empathy for. A lot of times we expend a lot of empathy on people who don't necessarily need it, and you should use your empathy towards them, but also think about the people who don't get a lot of empathy in this society.
I love the notion of empathy and compassion without bowing. That it's not. Yeah, I think that's how are we going to understand this? And it's not going to be. We got to be angry.
Yeah.
But how do you have anger and empathy side by side is the $1 million question. And I will leave that to our guests today. Rion, thank you so much for joining us. This was great. I've heard you read several times, but I see people clapping and it's silent. It's so weird. But I've been wanting to talk to you just especially about rhythm, especially about world building, but all these other topics as well. A couple quick things. Thanks to the Writers Center for letting us do this and using their Zoom account. And also remember, Old Town Books partnered with us on this. Please buy a copy of Rion's book or the next book you plan to buy if you already have his books from a local independent bookseller. If you are looking for one, Old Town Books is a great community-oriented bookseller, and I love them so much, and I want them to exist for far, far into the future. So please consider that. If you go to our webpage for this event or the Facebook event, there's a link directly to Old Town Books where you can order literally any book that's orderable from them and support them in this weird can't go to bookstores time. Anyway, again, thanks to all of you for coming. It's been fantastic. I've enjoyed it. I've enjoyed the talk, Rion. And that's it. Thank you so much. Have a good evening. We'll
Thanks for having me.
We're doing these about once a week. See you soon.